September 30th, 1955. Late afternoon on California's Route 466. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty highway that cut through the San Joaquin Valley. A silver Porsche 550 Spider, sleek, low to the ground, built for speed, raced west toward Salinas. Behind the wheel sat a young man with sandy blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, wearing a white t-shirt and jeans. His name was James Dean. He was 24 years old. In the passenger seat rode his mechanic, Rolf Witherich, gripping the door handle as the Porsche hit 90 miles per hour. They were heading to a race in Salinas, James's latest obsession. He'd bought the Porsche just weeks earlier, had it painted silver with the number 130 on the hood, and 2 words painted in red script on the back, "Little Bastard." At 5:45 p.m., near the intersection of Route 466 and Route 41, a black and white Ford sedan turned left across the highway. The driver, a 23-year-old college student named Donald Turnipseed, didn't see the low-slung silver Porsche racing toward him at 70 miles per hour. By the time James saw the Ford, it was too late. He tried to swerve. The cars collided with a sickening crunch of metal and glass. Rolf was thrown from the Porsche, injured but alive. Donald walked away with minor bruises. But James Dean, Hollywood's brightest young star, the rebel who'd captured a generation's restlessness in just 3 films, was trapped in the twisted wreckage. His neck was broken. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone, 24 years old. 3 movies, and an immortal legend. How did a farm boy from Indiana become the face of teenage rebellion? How did someone who barely had time to prove himself become one of the most iconic actors in film history? And what was James Dean running from on that lonely California highway? Welcome to Story Factory. I'm here to take you back through the lives of the stars who shaped our memories. The faces that flickered on silver screens in darkened theaters, the voices that spoke for a generation. Today, we're opening the story of James Dean and the heartbreaking truth behind Hollywood's eternal rebel. This isn't just a story about movies or fame or fast cars. It's a story about loneliness, about a boy who never got over losing his mother, about a young man searching for something he could never quite name. And it's a story about how sometimes legends aren't made by long careers. They're made by burning bright and fast and leaving before the world can look away. Let's go back to the beginning. Marion, Indiana, 1931. The Depression was tightening its grip on America. Factories were closing. Banks were failing. Families were struggling to put food on the table. On February 8th, in a small dental office above a drugstore, Mildred Dean gave birth to a son. They named him James Byron Dean. He was their only child. Mildred adored her boy. She was artistic, sensitive, played the violin, recited poetry. She taught James to appreciate music and art and literature. She encouraged him to perform, to recite poems at family gatherings, to be expressive. James's father, Winton, was different. Practical, emotionally distant, a dental technician who believed in hard work and self-sufficiency. He didn't understand his sensitive son, didn't know what to do with a boy who wanted to act and paint instead of play baseball. When James was 5, the family moved to Los Angeles. Winton had found work at a veterans hospital. They settled into a small apartment in Santa Monica, close to the ocean. For a while, life was good. Mildred would take James to the beach, to the movies, to museums. She was his whole world. Then in 1940, when James was 9 years old, Mildred got sick. Cancer. It happened fast. One day she was there, laughing and playing the violin. The next, she was in the hospital, pale and weak, fading. James visited her, held her hand, didn't understand why she wasn't getting better. Mildred Dean died on July 14th, 1940. James was 9 years old. He never really got over it. Winton couldn't cope. He was grieving, working long hours, and had no idea how to raise a boy alone. So he made a decision that would haunt James forever. He sent his son back to Indiana to live with his sister, Hortense, and her husband, Marcus Winslow, on their farm in Fairmount. James felt abandoned. First, his mother died. Then his father gave him away. For the rest of his life, James Dean would carry that wound, the belief that people you love will leave you, that you're always one step away from being alone. Fairmount was flat farmland, endless rows of corn and soybeans, conservative Quaker values, church on Sundays. The Winslows were kind, decent people who gave James stability, but they couldn't replace what he'd lost. James grew up quiet, moody, restless. He spent hours alone, wandering the fields, sketching, reading. At school, he was an outsider, too sensitive, too different, too odd. But James found one outlet: acting. At Fairmount High School, he joined the drama club, discovered he had a gift for performing. On stage, he could be someone else, feel something other than the grief and anger always simmering inside him. His drama teacher, Adeline Knoll, recognized his talent, encouraged him, told him he could be great if he worked at it. In 1949, James graduated high school and moved back to Los Angeles to live with his father and stepmother. It was awkward, tense. Winton wanted James to study law, to have a respectable career. James wanted to act. They fought. James moved out, enrolled at UCLA to study theater, and started auditioning for anything he could find: small theater productions, student films, bit parts in commercials. He was broke, sleeping on friends' couches, surviving on coffee and cigarettes. But he was determined. He watched Marlon Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire and was mesmerized. Brando was raw, emotional, real, everything Hollywood acting wasn't supposed to be. James wanted to be like that. He wanted to make people feel something. In 1951, James made a bold decision. He moved to New York City to study at the Actors Studio, the legendary school that taught method acting, the technique of drawing on your own emotions and experiences to create authentic performances. James thrived there. His pain, his loneliness, his anger, all the things that made him difficult in real life made him electric on stage. He started landing small roles on television, in live broadcasts of dramatic plays. He was intense, unpredictable, sometimes brilliant, sometimes impossible to work with. Directors didn't know what to make of him, but audiences noticed. There was something about this young man with the tousled blonde hair and wounded eyes. He felt dangerous. He felt real. In 1954, the director Elia Kazan was casting for a new film adaptation of John Steinbeck's novel East of Eden. He needed a young actor to play Cal Trask, a troubled son desperate for his father's approval. Someone told Kazan about James Dean. Kazan flew him out to Los Angeles for a screen test. The moment Kazan saw James perform, he knew. This wasn't just acting. This was a young man pouring his whole soul onto the screen. James got the part. It was his first starring role in a major Hollywood film. He was 23 years old. East of Eden was released in March 1955. The film told the story of Cal Trask, a sensitive young man who feels rejected by his stern father, who acts out in anger and desperation, who just wants to be loved. It was, in many ways, James Dean's own story. When Cal breaks down in tears, begging his father to accept him, you weren't watching an actor. You were watching James Dean's real pain. The film was a sensation. Critics raved. Audiences were mesmerized. This wasn't the polished, clean-cut Hollywood acting they were used to. This was raw, emotional, uncomfortable. James Dean became an overnight star, but Hollywood didn't know what to do with him. He was difficult on set, moody, argumentative, refusing to follow directions. He didn't care about being a movie star. He cared about the work, about being true to the character. He drove directors crazy, but he was undeniable on screen. His second film, Rebel Without a Cause, came out in October 1955, just weeks after his death. It would become the film that defined him forever. Rebel Without a Cause was about teenagers in 1950s America. Kids growing up in comfortable suburban homes with parents who had everything except the ability to connect with their children. James played Jim Stark, a new kid in town, lonely, misunderstood, desperate to prove himself. The red jacket, the switchblade fight, the anguished cry of "You're tearing me apart!" These images became iconic. But the film's most famous scene is quieter. Jim and his two friends, Judy, played by Natalie Wood, and Plato, played by Sal Mineo, hide out in an abandoned mansion. For a few hours, they pretend to be a family, safe and loved. It's heartbreaking because you know it can't last. And for James, who'd spent his life feeling abandoned, it was deeply personal. On set, James, Natalie, and Sal became close. They were all young, lonely, searching for something. Natalie was escaping a controlling stage mother. Sal was hiding his sexuality in an era that wouldn't accept him. And James was carrying all that grief from his childhood. They understood each other in a way no one else could. Rebel Without a Cause captured something essential about being young in 1950s America. The feeling that your parents didn't understand you, that society wanted you to conform, that you didn't fit in. James Dean became the voice of that generation. Teenagers saw themselves in him. He wasn't a hero. He was just a kid trying to figure out how to survive. His third and final film was Giant, an epic about oil, ambition, and racism in Texas. James played Jet Rink, a ranch hand who strikes it rich but loses his soul. It was his most mature performance, showing his range as an actor. He starred alongside Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson, Hollywood royalty. Elizabeth adored James, saw past his difficult exterior to the vulnerable boy underneath. They became close friends, but James was restless. Movies felt confining. He wanted to race cars. Racing gave him something acting couldn't: pure speed, adrenaline, a way to outrun everything haunting him. He bought a Porsche 356 Speedster, then upgraded to the faster 550 Spider. His friends warned him to slow down. His studio begged him not to race, but James couldn't stop. Speed was the only time he felt free. On September 21st, 1955, James appeared on a television commercial about safe driving. The host asked him for advice for young drivers. James looked into the camera and said, "Take it easy driving. The life you save might be mine." 9 days later, he was dead. The news broke late on the night of September 30th. Radio stations interrupted their programming. Newspapers printed special editions. Fans gathered outside theaters showing Rebel Without a Cause, sobbing, unable to believe it. James Dean, the rebel, the icon, the voice of a generation, was gone. His funeral was held in Fairmount, Indiana, back where it all began. Thousands of people lined the streets. His Aunt Hortense and Uncle Marcus were there, grieving the boy they'd raised. His father, Winton, stood stiff and silent, showing no emotion. Friends from Hollywood flew in: Elizabeth Taylor, Natalie Wood, Sal Mineo. They wept openly. James was buried in Park Cemetery in Fairmount next to his mother. The inscription on his gravestone was simple: James Byron Dean, 1931 to 1955. He was 24 years old. He'd made 3 films, and he became immortal. In the weeks and months after his death, something extraordinary happened. James Dean became more famous dead than alive. Rebel Without a Cause and Giant were released posthumously to enormous audiences. His image appeared on magazine covers, posters, T-shirts. Fan clubs formed around the world. Teenagers made pilgrimages to the crash site on Route 466, leaving flowers and photographs. James Dean became a symbol. He represented youth, rebellion, the refusal to conform, the ache of not being understood. He died before he could grow old, before he could compromise, before he could disappoint anyone. He stayed forever young, forever beautiful, forever the rebel. But who was James Dean, really? Behind the red jacket and the tortured stares, behind the fast cars and the method acting, there was a lonely boy who never got over losing his mother, a young man who felt abandoned by his father, an artist who poured all his pain into his work because he didn't know how else to express it. Maybe you remember the first time you saw Rebel Without a Cause, sitting in a dark theater, watching James Dean scream at his parents, at the world, at the unfairness of it all. Maybe you felt it too, that same anger, that same confusion, that same longing to be seen. Maybe you remember the shock of hearing he'd died so young, so senselessly, in a car crash on an empty highway. James Dean gave us permission to feel. In an era when men were supposed to be strong and silent, when teenagers were supposed to obey and conform, James showed that it was okay to be vulnerable, to be angry, to be hurt. He made it okay to not have all the answers. But the question remains, what was he running from on that September afternoon? Was it the pressure of fame? The fear that he'd never be good enough? The ghost of his mother, always just out of reach? Or was he simply going too fast because speed was the only thing that made him feel alive? We'll never know. All we have are 3 films, a handful of photographs, and the memory of a young man who burned bright and fast and left us too soon. Rest in peace, James Byron Dean. You gave us the ache of adolescence, the beauty of rebellion, and the reminder that sometimes the brightest stars don't last the longest, but they shine forever in our memories. Before we close, a brief note. This story is based on publicly available information, biographies, interviews, and historical records. Some conversations and small details have been dramatized to bring James's journey to life, but the heart of his story, his talent, his loneliness, his 3 iconic films, and his tragic death, is real. If this story brought back memories, if James Dean's face was part of your youth the way it was for so many, consider subscribing to Story Factory. We're here to revisit the legends who lit up silver screens in our younger days, to remember not just their fame, but their humanity. Because every legend has a story, and every story deserves to be told with respect. Thank you for listening. Until next time.